If you were a kid growing up in the 90s and early 2000s, the moment this logo appeared on screen, you knew you were in for a really fun time. Humongous Entertainment was one of the leading companies in kids' point-and-click adventure games, and along with Play School, Jumpstart, Living Books, and The Learning Company, helped define children's PC games of the time, as well as get a lot of kids hooked on computers and acting as a gateway to the world of PC gaming. Whether it was through fun gameplay with creative problem solving, or having memorable and colorful characters, their games have left their marks on many people's childhoods and are still fondly remembered to this day. So, I thought it would be fun to take a look at the company's history. Now, for this retrospective, I'll be taking a look back at the history of the Big 4 Junior Adventure games, as well as Backyard Sports and Moonbase Commander. Oh, not to worry, I will be covering the other games they made during this prologue. So, with all that said, I'm the MediaNutso, and this is the history of Humongous Entertainment. Our story begins back at LUCASARTS, with two key employees that will play a major role: programmer and game designer Ron Gilbert, and game producer Shelley Day. At the time, Gilbert was known for working on many of LucasArts' adventure games, including but not limited to the first two Monkey Islands and Maniac Mansion, and he also co-designed and coded the game engine that would become the standard for their future adventure games, the script creation utility for Maniac Mansion, or SCUM for short. Meanwhile, Day was the producer behind such games as Monkey Island 2, Test Drive, which later became the Need for Speed series, and Robot Rascals. One day, they were watching a 4-year-old boy, who was one of Shelley Day's sons, playing Monkey Island, and noticed that, though he couldn't read any of the dialogue, he was having a lot of fun just poking around, solving random puzzles, and opening and closing random doors. Following that, Day and Gilbert lamented the fact that there weren't any adventure games being made specifically for kids. Thus, they decided to resign from LucasArts along with a few other key employees, and after assembling a crackerjack team together, in March of 1992, they went on to found their own company in Woodinville, Washington, Humongous Entertainment, which they credit ex-LucasArts colleague Tim Schafer for suggesting the name. Dave would serve as the CEO and president, while Gilbert would be the creative director. Also, going with that name was a conscious choice on their part, as they wanted to be thought of more as an entertainment company rather than an educational one. Plus, it was vague enough that it would allow them to branch off into other forms of entertainment. In fact, the original plan was to start off by doing kids games, then quickly move into doing adult games, and eventually venture outside doing PC games. Considering how well the games they made turned out, they most certainly could have achieved the latter too. Also, Ron Gilbert made a deal with LucasArts where he would continue to work and develop the SCUM engine, but any changes made would revert back to LucasArts. However, in exchange, Humongous would get the license to use the engine for their games. When developing said games, the goal Day, Gilbert, and the crew had in mind was not to create educational games, but rather bring their own children's stories to life. Sure, they had some educational elements in there, but the main goal was to emphasize the entertainment aspect, since the other big kids game companies tended to focus more on the educational part. They also applied what was referred to as the principles of adventure games that they learned from their tenure at LucasArts, where, though the games were aimed at kids, they didn't dumb down the plot or the gameplay. They wanted them to have some level of intelligence and required the players to remember and strategize, like when they pick up an item that they may need to use later on.
Great! We found a wrench! Whoa! We did it!
The fruits of the team's labor would come to fruition with the release of their first game, Putt-Putt Joins the Parade for the MS-DOS, Mac, and most surprising of all, the 3DO. The end result worked out pretty well in their favor, as critics gave the game some good reviews, and it sold very well in its first year. It was a good start for the company, but shockingly and surprisingly, it almost ended up being their only game released. Why? You see, they had gotten Electronic Arts, and yes, I am talking about that Electronic Arts, to give them $300,000 to help get their company off the ground and to distribute their games on the then newly released 3DO. But this got them into legal trouble with LUCASARTS, who sued them over violating their licensing agreement of the Scum engine. Luckily for them, the court ended up settling in Humongous' favor, and they were allowed to continue forward with their operations. A year later, they came out with not just Putt-Putt's second adventure, Putt-Putt Goes to the Moon, but also Putt-Putt's Fun Pack, and earlier that year, a second adventure game, Fatty Bear's Birthday Surprise, starring a new character named, well, Fatty Bear, who was based on a real stuffed bear owned by the friend of the character's creator, Laurie Bauman Arnold. The plot of it is very simple. Fatty Bear and the other toys decide to throw a surprise party for their owner, Kayla, while she's sleeping. So, they have to get the room decorated and bake the birthday cake before Kayla wakes up. But it isn't that easy and straightforward, especially with a few of the items scattered about, and Kayla's new puppy getting loose, and Freddi having to catch her and get her back to the kitchen before she causes any more trouble. So, did this one turn out as well as Putt-Putt? Not really. When it hit the shelves on March 26, 1993, the game sold decently, and critics gave it good reviews. But it wasn't quite as popular as Putt-Putt was. In fact, one review, though overall positive, stated that if given the choice, players should take Putt-Putt over Fatty Bear. The only other game the character got was his own Fun Pack, which was later bundled together with Putt-Putt's and re-released in 1994 as Putt-Putt and Fatty Bear's Activity Pack, which also made it the last game Humongous released on the MS-DOS. The game doesn't have a lot in the way of unused elements, but it does have a couple of music cues exclusive to the 3DO version, like a rendition of Funeral March of a Marionette, which was also used in the demo, and a longer variation of another track. The only actual unused piece is a dialogue clip from the Veggie Head minigame. No clear reason was given as to why it was cut, but it's likely that there were concerns that some people might mishear it as something else.
Dear me, I am a sight.
So, with all that being said, why didn't Fatty Bear receive another adventure game? Well, in addition to not being as popular, supposedly, Humongous would have had to pay royalties to the original owner if they wanted to use him for future games, which the company wasn't willing to do. So, Fatty Bear was reduced to just getting background cameos in some of the later games. In 1994, Humongous Entertainment would see some significant changes, beginning with making the leap from the MS-DOS to the more advanced Windows 95, which would be reflected with the release of their second junior adventure series, Freddi Fish, which also marked quite a jump in visual quality and presentation. Where the previous games utilized the pixelated graphics of the MS-DOS, Freddi Fish would mark as their first game to use fully hand-drawn animation, which would become the main standard for many of their other games to come, and was also the first to implement interchangeable gamepads, which also became a big mainstay. Every time the game boots up, it randomizes which path the player is going to get, so no one player gets the same path each time. The next year saw not only the release of the third Putt-Putt game, and the first one made specifically for Windows, Putt-Putt Saves the Zoo, but they also re-released the MS-DOS games on the system, and they collaborated with Random House to create a trilogy series called the Junior Field Trips, with Let's Explore the Farm and the Airport both released on July 11th, and Let's Explore the Jungle on November 14th of that year. Hosted by a new character, Buzzy the Knowledge Bug, he takes players on tours of, well, a farm, an airport, and the 3 different types of jungles in the world, while also breaking down how everything in each place functions. Now, an interesting trivia note about Let's Explore the Farm. It was actually first released on November 22nd, 1994, and the series was originally called the Junior Encyclopedias. And as shown here, the graphics look much rougher compared to the later entries. It was later updated to be more in line with the other two, though the overall look remained intact. I guess Encyclopedia would have sounded too boring to the intended audience. Also, in Let's Explore the Airport, there are 4 scenes that didn't make it into the finished version, which include...
Now that's a lot of gas! Excuse me. Now that's a lot of gas!
Ye gods, I'm late. The wife will have my head on a platter for this. What'll I do?
Warning! Do not try this at home. Rabbits hate having their ears pulled. Who wouldn't?
Hey there, partner. That's going to be about $5 for that parking deal there. Are you waiting for something, man?
There's also some music from both Freddi Bear and Putt-Putt Joins the Parade that were left over and were probably meant to play in the waiting room, and a couple of unused sounds. Some chatter that was probably meant for, again, the waiting room, and a bit for the radio where one would hear excerpts of various clip points and a bit of the unused song from the first Freddi Fish. Lastly, there's a level editor for the Lost Luggage minigame. As for Let's Explore the Jungle, it only has the full version of the bonus level music, and a line of code that'll add an on-screen message telling what size font the game is currently using. Yeah, this one was pretty pointless. So, how come the Junior Field Trips never got any more entries? 2 reasons. The 3 games were neither critical nor commercially successful, and because the crew weren't as invested in them as they were with the Junior Adventures. During that same year, Shelley Day and Ron Gilbert established a new subdivision called Cave Dog Entertainment, which would allow them to develop games of varying genres aimed at a much older audience, their most well-known one being the critical and commercial hit Total Annihilation. Unfortunately, it and a reskin of it, Total Annihilation Kingdoms, would be their only games released, as the division ended up dissolving in 2000. In 1996, Humongous released their 3rd Junior Adventure series, Pajama Sam, and also came out with a new spin-off line called the Junior Arcades, which were essentially their takes on different arcade games. Like Balloon-O-Rama was doing Breakout, Sockworks adapted the Lost Luggage minigame from Let's Explore the Airport, Dog on a Stick was basically Gilbert, Maze Madness and Lost and Found were collectathons, and the last 3 were various side-scrolling shooters. The reason they were made was twofold: because the crew really enjoyed creating them, and they allowed the company to put out more games in a single year. Released from November of '96 to September of 2000, they would have 2 compilation discs dubbed the Super Duper Arcades. But here's a bit of trivia. Both Sockworks and Hold the Mustard would have some connections to a couple of the later adventure games. Plus, the latter has the distinction of being the only one to be first released as part of a compilation disc, Super Duper Arcade 2, before receiving an individual release. Most of them don't have much in the way of unused elements. Just a few examples. In Maze Madness, there's an early build of the minigame Squoosh that will later be seen in Putt-Putt Travels Through Time. Sockworks has a bad level that the player will be redirected to if it fails to load up a level.
Uh-oh, something's wrong. The Sockomatic only sets itself up like this when it can't read its instructions from the CD. The CD might be dirty, or even scratched. I think you better quit the game and try cleaning the CD.
And an unused one that'll never get selected to appear. Lost and Found has 4 unused music loops. Some funky music that plays if funky is input as the passcode. Typing in crazy will cause all the background and item layers to shift around. Putting in bonus or ended will take the player to the bonus games and the ending respectively. An early design of the toll booth enemy that may or may not resemble a developer. And in Hold the Mustard, it has a weird unused music cue identical to the song The Napoleon Complex. However, out of all of them, Dog on a Stick has the most unused graphics of any of the junior arcades, including unused level themes, like one for space and a kitchen themed one, a variant of the penguin enemy with a summer outfit, a very weird skunk-esque iteration of Pep's sprite from Balloon-O-Rama, some holder animation for the presents in the bonus levels, an early version of the customs level button, and unused enemies. There's also some joke credits that were just meant as a placeholder, but it does give some details on its early development stages, like the game was first called Pogo Dog, and they also slipped in some not so subtle jabs to Rep Mathis and the other team that were working on some of the other junior arcade games. And the superimposed heads shown are of game designer Matt Mayen, lead artist Tom Berry, and programmer and level designer Dolores Carney. Oh, and one more tidbit. These games predated Super Mario Maker by being the earliest games to allow players to custom make and play their own levels. They were truly ahead of the curve with these ones. Anywho, in that same year, they'd go through a major change-up. On July 11th, Humongous Entertainment was purchased by GT Interactive for $76 million. At the time, this was good for them, as this gave the company some needed financial support, and what further bolstered it was that GT left Humongous alone and allowed them to continue doing operations their way. 1997 would be another big year, with Humongous coming up with 3 new series. One was a spy genre spoof that would become their 4th junior adventure series, and the oldest skewing, Spy Fox. The second would be the first in a series of junior sports games that would later become its own big series, Backyard Baseball, and the last was a younger skewing educational duology called Big Thinkers, with kindergarten and first grade both released on October 22nd. The best way to describe the two would be, imagine a much trippier version of Jumpstart, but with two very enthusiastic, childlike teenagers that can morph into just about anything. And they are the most educational games Humongous ever made, more so than the junior field trips. The gameplay of both is very simple. Players solve various puzzles or play minigames and be rewarded with smart stars for their efforts. The higher the difficulty, the more they earn. Once they've collected enough of them, they can take on the Superstar Smarts Challenge and play it as many times as they want.
How many jars of mustard would equal my height now? Start by moving that food item next to me.
We've got lots of stuff for sale today. Click on your coins until they add up to the price of what you want to buy.
These two really don't have a lot of unused elements. Now, as previously stated, they only came out with just the kindergarten and first grade editions. But that wasn't originally the plan. There was a third game, the second grade edition, being developed, and would have been released the following year. But it was cancelled as it was too ambitious for one team to develop 3 games at once. Not helping either that the 2 games didn't sell very well and critics gave them some mixed reviews. At the same time, they had struck a deal with Lancet Media Entertainment to adapt their games into animated television shows that were to premiere on PBS in the fall of 1998. You probably remember Lancet as being the production company behind the classic series Reading Rainbow. Oh, but that's not all. They also planned on making videos and even movies. But for whatever reason, those plans, along with the shows, ended up falling through. Ashamed really, as they could have easily made for some great and entertaining shows. Though, from what was said about the planned Pajama Sam series, it was a good thing that version didn't make it to air. On a side note, many of the games released that year were dedicated to programmer Brett Barrett, who unfortunately passed away the year prior. Anyways, the next year, the company really struck it big when they teamed up with Nickelodeon to develop and release 6 Blue's Clues games, released between 1998 and 2000. Though Infogrames would later come out with 2 more in 2002. The games were highly praised for faithfully translating the show to the games. In fact, 2 of them were adapted from 2 episodes. Unfortunately, due to licensing issues, they may never see any kind of reissue on current platforms. But physical copies are easy to find online and are pretty cheap. By November of 1999, there would be another big company buyout. But this one would spell the beginning of the end for Humongous Entertainment. Amidst a lot of financial difficulties, GT Interactive was acquired by the French-based Infogrames, and would be renamed Infogrames Inc. At first, it didn't seem too bad, as in 2000, Humongous released a set of Activity Center games called the One Stop Fun Shop for all of the Junior Adventures, except for Spy Fox. In them, one can make various cards, party decorations, paper hats, and even have special stories unique to each that one can color in. But now, this is where the story starts to get a bit more complicated. By February of 2000, Ron Gilbert had grown very frustrated with all of Infogrames' executive interference and resistance to creating new intellectual properties, which was perfectly exemplified with what was going to be their first ever pre-rendered CGI adventure game, A Gas Pocket Adventure, Aliens Ate My Cookies. So, he and Shelley Day announced their plans to buy back the company from Infogrames, and for Humongous to become independent once again, to which they got the blessing of Infogrames CEO Bruno Bonnell to do it. Less than a month later, they had everything ready to go. But the day of the purchase was unfortunately both at a very bad and ironic time, because it was on the same day as when the dot-com bubble burst, where many big internet-based companies in the tech industry were hemorrhaging money really fast. As a result, all of their funding got pulled, and in the early spring, they ultimately made the hard decision to resign from their positions at the company. And I do mean hard. The day they announced it, Ron Gilbert stayed virtually silent about it, while Shelley Day was in sorrow. Honestly, who could blame them? After all, Humongous was their baby, and they were essentially being forced to give it up. From there, they, along with 20 other key employees and frequent outside writer and collaborator Dave Grossman, went on to found a new game company, Hula Bee Entertainment, in 2001. They made a distribution deal with Disney to have their games published and released under the new division of Disney Interactive, Plaid Banana Entertainment. Unfortunately, the company didn't last very long. Why? Well, in March of 2003, Shelley Day got into some heated legal trouble for committing bank fraud due to forging bank statements. And not long after that, in July, Ron Gilbert had resigned as well, though he didn't specify why. In the end, Hula Bee only came out with 6 games, their most notable ones being Moopin' Dreadly and the Treasure on Bing Bong Island, and Olo and the Sunny Valley Fair. The rest were tie-ins to a couple of Disney and Pixar films, and Cocoa Puffs. Though the company would try to go on by making some casual games like Mahjong Jr., without the right financing and talent, it just didn't work out. Thus, Hula Bee shut down their operations in 2005. Anyways, back at Humongous, things had truly started taking a turn for the worse. On June 13, 2001, Infogrames laid off 82 employees, or about 40% of their staff, which really plummeted company morale and employee confidence across the board. However, the troubles don't stop there. When they had a new game in production, Moon-Based Commander, Infogrames had so little faith in it, they didn't give it the right kind of promotion, and even went as far as to not give it an E3 presentation, resulting in almost no one knowing about it, and the game ended up as a big failure when it hit shelves in late summer of 2002. Man, that is just icy. Now, backing up a bit to 2000, Infogrames had purchased Hasbro Interactive, who at the time owned the rights to the Atari brand, and on May 7th, 2003, they decided to rename Infogrames Inc. to Atari Inc. Later that year, Humongous released 2 more junior adventure games, Putt-Putt, Pep's Birthday Surprise, and Pajama Sam and Life is Rough When You Lose Your Stuff, respectively. The big difference with these 2 compared to the others is that, where the previous games utilized the Scum engine, these 2, along with the current backyard sports games at the time, used a new game engine dubbed the Yaga engine, and were also produced on smaller budgets. It really shows. Suffice to say, while critics gave them good reviews, fans on the other hand have called them the worst of their respective series, and they both ended up as flops, thus putting a sad end to the junior adventure line. After that, they continued to limp along with more backyard sports games until August of 2005, when the company was sold to the majority stockholder Infogrames SA for $10.3 million, on the condition that all titles that Humongous had developed be released through March 31st, 2006, of which they didn't have any. And the day after that, the company had officially dissolved. The last official game Humongous ever made was Backyard Football 2006. This was certainly a sad day for both the remaining crew members and longtime fans to see the company they loved so much come to such an unceremonious end. After that, Infogrames transitioned all of the assets and brands to a new company, Humongous Inc. Yeah, real original. Now, no longer bound by any of the agreements of Atari Inc., they would go on to re-release some of the games along with Majesco Entertainment. Speaking of Majesco, in 2008, they attempted to port over the first installment of each Junior Adventure series, sans Putt-Putt, over to the Wii, by subcontracting the job out to Mystic Software, who in turn gave it to their Ukrainian post, Mystic Soft. And how did those turn out? Pretty bad, because they would get them into a lot of legal trouble. How so? Well, instead of properly porting the games, the Mystic Soft crew just put in a scum VM build without permission, thus violating their general publishing license and failing to give credit to the scum VM team, resulting in the latter to file a lawsuit against the company. It didn't help either that the ports themselves were heavily rushed to meet deadlines and had very little care given to them. And it really shows. They run on slow machine mode for some reason, play at a faster rate than normal, as well as pitching up the audio, and having a lot of glitches.
It says to find Grandma Grouper's treasure chest, go to the volcano. I'm gonna be rich when I find that treasure.
Needless to say, it didn't work out well, and the Wii port releases ended up getting pulled from store shelves, thus ending their short-lived Wii port attempt. There were a few other attempts to revive them, like with Freddi Fish ABC Under the Sea for the Nintendo DS, which was released in 2008 in Europe, then in America 2 years later. Unfortunately, it would get criticized by longtime fans for just being a purely educational title instead of being an adventure game, its very simplistic gameplay, and for not having the same spirit of the main series, and the game would become a failure. This in turn discouraged Atari Inc. from making any more attempts to revive the adventure games on new consoles. So is this where Humongous Entertainment's story ends? Nope, not even close. In fact, it would actually get a little better from here. In 2009, amidst a difficult financial situation, Infogrames SA, who by then had been renamed Atari SA, filed bankruptcy for 3 American subsidiaries: Atari Inc., Atari Interactive, and of course, Humongous Inc. Hence, on July 19, 2013, as part of the Resolution proceedings, the Humongous brand, along with most of its assets, were sold off to Tomo Inc., while the Backyard Sports series was acquired by the Evergreen Group, and Moonbase Commander was purchased by Rebellion Developments. Now with the trademark on their hands, Tomo decided to relaunch the Humongous Entertainment website in January of 2014, and in collaboration with Nightdive Studios, they went on to digitally re-release many of their games on the digital distribution service Steam between April of 2014 and August of 2015, exactly 9 years after the original company had dissolved. They've also been released on Android, the App Store, and the iOS. Though Tomo hasn't been doing much with the company recently, aside from special promotions and sales happening, they did help in bringing the games back for a whole new generation. However, before all of that, there was a brief period where the games were released on Android and iOS by Nimbus Games, and the very first one they put out? Putt-Putt Saves the Zoo. It was also released on Big Fish Games. Also, in 2013, Nimbus Games came out with Freddi Fish's and Putt-Putt's Funhouse, which were puzzle activity games themed to their respective series. That's about all they were. As you can see, as I said at the start, nearly 30 years after their initial releases, Humongous Entertainment's games have left their impact with both kids and adults, mainly those that grew up playing them, thanks to their strong writing, characters, and humor that even parents can appreciate. So much so, in fact, that Ron Gilbert stated that when the kids went off to bed, their parents would be sneaking off to play them as a guilty pleasure. Over its lifetime, Humongous had sold over 15 million units combined, and their critical success wouldn't go unnoticed, as they would win over 400 awards of excellence. The crew set out to make entertaining games and tell their own children's stories, and they didn't just achieve it, they exceeded them in the best way possible. They've become the kind of games that just make you feel good replaying them, and knowing the thought and care the crew put in when making them, it makes them just that much more special when revisiting them. Join me next time as we'll begin our journey into each of their 5 big series, starting off with the friendliest and most helpful purple convertible you'll ever meet.